Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is the first animated Spider-Man film from Sony and Sony Animation Studios. The film, clocking in at 1 hour and 56 minutes, is a highly stylized animated feature detailing one of the multiple Spider-Men, this time Miles Morales, who, while being a fan favorite, has yet to break through to a mainstream movie audience.
Wasn't aware that I'd actually be doing a response to a movie review, especially one that's a couple years old, but this showed up in my Twitter feed, so I guess I'm doing that now. Wonder why he put Miles Morales as a douche. I guess all that and more will be answered on this episode of Why the Hell Did You Click This Video? This is going to be a little weird, but that's fine because this channel isn't exactly a stranger to weird things. Speaking of that, if you're new here, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, hit the bell notification icon, you'll be able to see when new episodes come out, and if you're not new here, then you already know that this is where we get into the fan art section before getting into the bulk of the video. So first we have a Rule 63 Bunny Suris by Bumbling Bee, and we have what looks to be a very disappointed Suris by Whelp, followed by this very stylized piece by Yarakaro. As always, thank you all for your fan art submissions, and let's get right into the video.
Sony, now riding a wave of goodwill from the deal with Marvel Studios and Peter Parker appearing in the MCU, has decided to capitalize on that warm fuzzy feeling from the audience by utilizing some of the lesser-known characters in order to build their own ill-conceived Spider-Verse.
Right, you do know that the animation alone for this movie took 4 years, which means production of it happened well before the creation of Spider-Man Homecoming and Civil War. Moreover, it's not an ill-conceived Spider-Verse, considering that many of these different characters already existed in the comic books. Into the Spider-Verse, for the most part, is a one-off film, not an attempt to start an entirely new franchise. I hope we get a franchise out of it, but the intent seems to have been to make one very decent art film. But let's go ahead and hear what your side of the story is.
While the film attempts to be something unique and original, it descends into what's little more than a focus group by throwing spider characters up on the screen and seeing which ones the audience reacts to.
What? No, it doesn't. The film has an incredibly unique stylized look that's supposed to resemble graffiti art. Its frame rate is built to resemble that of stop-motion video, and even if the inclusion of other characters from the Spider-Man universe end up being window dressing, that's fine because this isn't their story, this is Miles Morales' story.
The result is a film that's not only obnoxious, but suffers from an incoherent tone, featuring an unlikable main character, and at times actually became physically difficult to watch. This review is now heading into what's known as spoiler territory, so don't say I didn't warn you.
Well, before you get into the spoiler territory, I can't wait to see what you mean when you say that Miles Morales is an unlikable character. Yeah, he doesn't have the greatest relationship with his dad in the beginning of the film, but he grows past that. That is kind of the point of the film. So, let's go ahead and get this shit show on the road.
The main story, written by Phil Lord and directed by Bob Perschetti, Peter Ramsey, and Rodney Rothman, centers on Miles Morales, played by Shalique Moore, a biracial teen who many critics feel the need to remind us that alone is justification for this movie.
Who? What film critics have said that because it stars a biracial teen, you have to watch the movie? Really, I would love some substantiation of that claim. Every time the film was recommended to me, either by a friend or by a film critic who happened to be making a video or a blog, the context was always that it had an interesting take on Miles Morales. It actually made him a likable character, which the comics had failed to do on routine occasions. The synergy between the artwork of the film and the music of the film were constantly praised, but never, not once, did I hear, yeah, it's got a black guy in it, and that's why you should watch it. The first time I have heard this exact phrase is from your mouth on this 2-year-old video.
Arrives at a new school where he doesn't know anybody, while his father, who is an NYPD officer, openly embarrasses him in front of his new schoolmates. Nothing like tapping into that feeling of teenage alienation, right? Miles, who also happens to be a graffiti artist in addition to being a talented science student, because why the hell not?
Is there something about being a good graffiti artist that suddenly means that you shouldn't also be able to have a proclivity for things like science? I feel like I might be smelling a certain style of bias already.
Is a Spider-Man fan, and his dad isn't. Miles gets along with his uncle, who his father says has made some bad choices, and the two have grown apart, which leads to a plot twist in the third act. One night in an abandoned subway tunnel that Miles' uncle has shown him after spray painting graffiti and conveniently being bitten by a radioactive spider from Alchemex, he just so happens to stumble upon a battle between Spider-Man and the Green Goblin. I think it's the Green Goblin, they really never make it clear.
Then maybe you should have watched the movie another time before spouting your ignorant opinion on the internet. Spider-Man literally refers to him as Norman. You know, like Norman Osborn? You know, like the guy who became the first Green Goblin? One of the most well-understood and well-known stories in Spider-Man fiction, specifically because of the Sam Raimi trilogy of films, the most well-known Spider-Man films, began with that plot? No, please, tell me again how they didn't make it abundantly clear that this is Green Goblin. Moreover, if you're a comics fan, then you know that the version of Green Goblin that exists in the Ultimate Universe, ergo the universe where Miles Morales is Spider-Man, contains this Green Goblin, as this Green Goblin beats Peter Parker to death in the Ultimate Universe. A quick Google search would have solved this for you. You don't need to be a Spider-Man aficionado to know this.
Anyway, as it turns out, that tunnel is home to a large super collider built by the Kingpin, who looks more like an overgrown potato played by Liev Schreiber. Kingpin's plan is to use the super collider to open up portals to other dimensions because reasons.
Reasons that are clearly laid out in the movie. Kingpin lost his family, and he desperately wants to find a timeline where they still exist so that he can see them again. Also, you realize that this is a heavy stylized movie, so having the proportions of Kingpin completely and totally inflated are also perfectly normal. So far, it seems like you either deliberately reach for straws or make up holes in the movie's logic that the movie itself explains adequately.
Spider-Man is killed by Kingpin after the battle, but not before giving Miles the anti-MacGuffin. But it just so happens that the super collider has sucked various spider people through the portal into Miles' dimension, one of which is a version of Peter Parker, only this one is a fat, middle-aged, out-of-shape, burger-eating loser who has grown tired of being Spider-Man after divorcing Mary Jane. The whole movie then becomes an exercise in trying to get the central MacGuffin, a flash drive, repaired in order to send the other spider people home before their cells break down, while learning a valuable lesson that everyone deep down inside can be a hero. Well, aw shucks, isn't that special?
You say that so condescendingly, but that's been what Stan Lee has said is the purpose of Spider-Man for ages. The whole reason that Peter Parker is a college student suffering desperately in debt at a dead-end job is because he's deliberately crafted to be an everyman that anyone could be. You don't have to be a billionaire like Batman or born with superhuman strength because you were forged on another planet like Superman. The idea of Spider-Man is and has always been that everyone has the ability to be Spider-Man. If you haven't understood this point, then you haven't understood Spider-Man, like ever. This is why so much of Spider-Man media has also taken the moniker of with great power comes great responsibility. Because while everyone can wield power and become a great hero, the trick is to mature to a point where you understand how to do so responsibly. These are lessons that anyone can grasp. And again, if you missed these, then you weren't paying attention to Spider-Man.
The film's biggest, most glaring problem is that while it tries to be all things to all people, it ends up becoming an incoherent, disjointed mess.
How does the film try being all things to all people? What? The film literally focuses on one character's journey, Miles Morales. Through that journey, the Peter Parker from the other dimension finds the motivation to become the Peter Parker that Miles looked up to, but this is framed as a parallel to Miles' journey. The film is very focused on Miles as the main character, and the main supporting character being the Peter Parker from the other dimension. Yes, there are other characters. They are side characters, much like in every other movie that has ever existed.
The story suffers from severe tonal inconsistencies. One moment, it's a kids movie. The next, it's a serious superhero film.
Wait, You've never been exposed to media that's both? Batman the Animated Series is a kids series, but it is a series that is also an incredibly serious superhero universe. By extension, the entire DC Animated Universe is like that. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I would highly suggest you guys check out Jay's Reviews channel. He has an incredibly good episode-by-episode breakdown of the entire Justice League Animated Universe. Anyway, that shout out of the way. If we use Batman the Animated Series, it is a cartoon aimed at children that is aired at a time when children would watch the show. However, even though it is a show geared towards children, it tackles very adult concepts. It tackles things like personal identity, what it means to come into your own, especially when you get into things like the Phantasm film, which, you know, coming into your own is also a central thesis of this movie that you're watching right here.
The next, it's a comedy. The next after that, it's a family film. Sometimes these tonal shifts all occur within the same scene.
Usually if those tonal shifts are happening in the same scene, then it is a scene that is constructed to accomplish all of those things. Have you heard of the concept of comedic relief? You can have an otherwise serious film that has comedic relief. Take Star Wars, a very serious film centered around the plot of a bloody war between a rebellion and a totalitarian empire run by the Sith, yet from the very first film in this franchise, R2-D2 and C-3PO, and even to a lesser extent Chewbacca, are all comedic relief. C-3PO will say something that the audience might be thinking. This leads to everybody trying to tell him to shut up and don't tell them the odds. Chewbacca will say something that only Han Solo recognizes as a joke because nobody else understands his language. These are comedic scenes in an otherwise serious film. This happens all the time. The job of a good writer is to be able to interweave the comedy with everything else. The fact that these things exist in the same film does not mean that the film has a problem with tone. Unless you have such a terrible palate for films that the only thing you can actually grasp are one-note films.
It gives the film no clear sense of what it wants to be or what it's trying to accomplish. Jokes fall flat, bits of dialogue seem forced as if to remind you that you're watching a Spider-Man movie by throwing out references only fans would appreciate. That's if they weren't packaged in such an annoying shell that they come across as disingenuous and cynical.
No, disingenuous and cynical is definitely what I'm seeing right now in this review, but usually a good reviewer will have an example of why this is the case. Perhaps maybe a scene you'd like to show us that shows your point?
You can never get a grasp on anything because the landscape of the film is constantly shifting under your feet.
Scene? Explanatory scene. Scene that shows us what's wrong, opposed to just this background scene that just shows, again, a multi-layered scene that has bits of comedy and bits of tension. But by the way, did you know that tense scenes generally get alleviated by comedy so that the audience themselves will not be as tense the entire way through, so as to make them more comfortable? It's almost as if these are psychological things that filmmakers have been using for years.
The main character of the story, Miles Morales, is not likable in any way, shape, or form. This makes any of the stakes in the film feel forced, as if the director and screenwriter are the guy in the audience saying to someone, "Oh, that's cool, right? Isn't this cool?"
So I guess I'm going to give up on getting the explanatory scene about how certain scenes are forced and fall flat and all that other nonsense. Now you want to focus on Miles Morales, which is good. At least you're having some kind of focus. But could you give us an example of why Miles Morales is unlikable? That would be helpful.
The other spider people in the movie are interesting, however, they don't actually do anything. They are dropped into this universe or set up for a particular joke, and then they go back to being cardboard cutouts in order to make Miles look good for the audience. This is particularly frustrating as the marketing for this film focused on them. This seems to concede that after the fact, Sony didn't believe that Miles Morales was a strong enough character to carry a film on his own.
No, that's not what that means. That means that they knew what worked well in marketing, and they also know what works well in a story, as opposed to having a story be incredibly disjointed by trying to focus heavily on multiple different spider people. The story is focused on one or two spider people, with everyone else being relegated to background and side character, as they should in a story that is written to focus on Miles. Given that Miles Morales was not the most popular Spider-Man, it's always been Peter Parker for the most part. Few of us actually liked Doc Ock as Spider-Man 2, though. Your marketing department understands that Miles might not be that popular, not right now anyway. The film does a very good job of making Miles likable, however. So market the film with something people will want to see. People who've read a lot of Ultimate Spider-Man generally don't want to see a film about Miles. But a film that includes Spider-Man Noir, that's new and interesting. That's something they might want to see. This isn't about Sony not having confidence that Miles can handle things in a last-minute decision. This is about smart marketing decisions, period. Take a movie like Wreck-It Ralph. It's a great movie, but most of the marketing made me believe that I was going to be seeing a lot more of the different video game characters than I did. I thought they were going to be a central part of the plot as opposed to window dressing. It doesn't say anything about the actual product that I received, though. The marketing for Tangled is almost like a horror film, and yet it's a standard Disney princess film because they knew that trying to advertise another standard Disney princess film wouldn't go as well as marketing something different. You're trying to throw these criticisms out as if they say something about Miles himself as a character, but they don't. You need to view the marketing behind a film and the actual film you are watching as two separate entities.
Peter Parker is yet another victim of the current deconstruction trend of popular characters. Because who doesn't love to see the thing that they love torn down to make another character look better?
I love how you show Rey there. You know that Luke being torn down isn't made to make Rey look better, right? It's to show what age can do to someone. It's to show how someone can become incredibly cynical and jaded in their old time, regardless of their past heroic accomplishments. This is the exact same thing being shown with Peter Parker, but I don't want to talk about Rey right now, because I think that Rey was handled very well in the new Star Wars series, except for in the third movie. Most criticisms that have been levied at Rey have been things that have been celebrated for other Star Wars characters in the past, between the books, video games, and movies. Still don't understand the hate boner for Rey specifically. Moreover, the comparison is not Peter Parker being there to make Miles look better. That Peter Parker looks the way he does because the movie shows you a perfect version of Peter Parker, a version of Peter Parker that Miles can look up to. This Peter Parker is not bad so that Miles can look better. This Peter Parker is supposed to be a stark contrast to another Peter Parker.
And don't think for a second that the symbolism of killing the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Peter Parker and the fat, out-of-shape version as a stand-in for the longtime fans is lost on me.
Wait, what do you think the symbolism is there? I'm dead serious. I was curious before when you made a connection between a scientist and a graffiti artist not necessarily being good correlates. What's the connection here? Why do you have an issue with a person being killed just because they have blonde hair and blue eyes?
So, you, Phil Lord.
Explain that?
Peter is supposed to be reluctantly training Miles. But after literally one training session in which Miles doesn't even seem to get a basic handle on his newfound powers, he somehow becomes so proficient that he not only saves the other spider people, but New York and probably the world. Once again because reasons and why the hell not.
No, it's not because reasons and why the hell not. There's actually a decent bit of time that happens between these two scenes, between Miles not having a handle on his powers and Miles actually gaining a handle on his powers. Moreover, the narrative device being used right now is called The Lie the Hero Believes. If you want to actually know how this works, please read Creating Stunning Character Arcs Part 2. This is an article by K.M. Weiland, and I will be linking it in the description. Also, another shout out to Totally Not Mark, who introduced me to this concept in the first place. To be succinct, the lie your character believes is an important part of constructing certain character arcs, where they are as adequate as they need to be at everything they can be. However, there is something they're missing. There is some lie that they are believing right now. The lie that Miles Morales believes is that he needs to be like Peter Parker, and all of his attempts to be like Peter Parker will ultimately end up in failure, because he's not Peter Parker. Peter Parker is Peter Parker, and given the movie we're looking at, that means more than one thing. Miles has to become comfortable in his own skin. Miles has to be comfortable with who he is. The entire movie, from top to bottom, begins with Miles in an environment where he's comfortable being who he is, and then Miles being thrown into an environment where he's no longer comfortable, the new school his dad wants him to go to. Any attempt for Miles to be someone he's not is immediately awarded with some type of punishment. Either his powers not operating correctly, or him getting essentially ridiculed in school. However, when Miles comes into his own and actually becomes who he's supposed to be, himself, he gains a better handle on his powers, because his powers are linked very heavily in his own psychology. It's shown in the movie with things like his invisibility powers that his mental state have an incredible effect on whether or not his powers will operate correctly. When Miles is done being a nervous wreck and starts to become his own person, visually showcased by him spray painting his own Spider-Man suit, he suddenly has a better hold on all of his powers. This is a common character arc. Moreover, it is a good character arc. The reason that this is something that Peter Parker is not able to teach him very well is because this Peter Parker also believes a lie. He believes that he is not himself anymore. He has to learn to be a better Peter Parker. He has to learn to be himself. And that's when he starts operating much better within the framework of the movie. Miles, likewise, when he learns to be Miles and stop trying to be Peter Parker, equally starts functioning better within the framework of the film. The other characters don't have to go through an arc like this, because the other characters already understand the truth. The Noir Spider-Man doesn't try to be anything he's not. Penny Parker doesn't try to be anything he's not. And Peter Parker also does not try to be anything he's not. They are all equally comfortable in their skins. The only characters who are not comfortable being who they are Miles and the interdimensional Peter Parker.
Sounds like someone else we know?
Comparisons back to Rey are astounding, but I assure you, Miles is a much better handled character than Rey, regardless of my personal thoughts on the character.
The one character that was kind of interesting was this film's version of Gwen Stacy, played by Haley Steinfeld, aka Spider-Woman or Spider-Gwen. However, she doesn't have a whole lot to do. She shows up, throws a web, saves Peter and Miles, and that's about it. She goes back to being another cardboard cutout along with the rest of the cast. And since when is there a Batcave under Aunt May's tool shed? You've turned Peter Parker into Batman and Aunt May into Alfred.
Okay, so Gwen, like the other spider people, is already comfortable with who she is. That is the reason why she does not have to have a character arc. She already understands the truth about being herself. As for when did the Spider Cave become a thing? Okay, so the Spider Cave in this movie is an adaptation of the Spider Cave from Marvel's Ultimate Spider-Man cartoon series. In that series, there is an episode where J. Jonah Jameson has a $10 million reward offered to anyone who can unmask Spider-Man. As a result, Spider-Man has to leave New York and find a place to stay. He still wants to be able to operate as a crime fighter, so he has a headquarters that is built by Ollie in the middle of Boston. This Spider Cave is in fact a direct parody of the Bat Cave from the Batman series. But the fact of the matter is, as Into the Spider-Verse is a giant Easter egg hunt for Spider-Man lore, having a Spider Cave that is an adaptation of something that already existed in the Spider Universe, this is not something new, and that cave itself being a good excuse to have several Easter eggs hidden inside it as well, is a perfectly natural thing for the movie to do. Aunt May being the butler, as opposed to the original butler from the series, is just what happens when you have adaptation. Just like in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where Hank Pym is not the one who creates Ultron, but Tony Stark is, because Hank Pym had not been introduced yet in the series, as Ant-Man had not been created yet. These are standard things that happen with adaptations. They want the Spider Cave from the series, but they can't use the same backstory from that series, so they adapt it for this movie. There's nothing wrong with that. This isn't a shoehorned thing in that the movie came up with. It already existed in other Spider-Man media. If you had taken any amount of time to actually educate yourself on other Spider-Man media, then you'd understand this, but I know you didn't, because you didn't even hear Peter Parker say Ultimate Green Goblin's name when he said he was Norman. Clearly.
And without giving away too many spoilers, the one Spider-Man character that would have been best suited for a standalone movie was reserved for an end credit scene and was turned into a fucking punchline.
Yes, but had they actually brought in that Spider-Man, you would have found something else to complain about because the film's main character is Miles Morales.
The entire look of the film is atrocious. Sony Animation went for a highly stylized look that was supposed to replicate a comic book, but when printed, the plates were supposed to be slightly out of alignment. The end result is something that looks blurry, out of focus, and is difficult to watch.
It's not difficult to watch. The out-of-alignment look was meant specifically to look like graffiti art. The style the movie is going for is that of graffiti art. You also complained earlier that the movie didn't have an identity and wasn't actually unique, yet this visual style is in fact one of the most unique parts about the film. Also, if you look at the production history of the movie, there's a lot of different techniques that were used to get the visual style that we see in the movie right now. One, if you know anything about animation, is the movie's emphasis on keyframing. Typically, in animation, you do things in ones, in which there is a frame for every single one of the 24 frames that you typically see in a given second. Animating on twos is what this movie attempts to do, which a lot of traditional animation used to do as well. This is where there's only a keyframe on every second of the 24 frames, so only 12 frames actually have an animation. This allows you to get to your dynamic posing faster, and it makes things look a lot more quick and choppy. This is what leads to some of the more stop-motion looking aspects of the film, and it makes it look great. As opposed to things looking like stock animation that we've been seeing from Pixar for decades now, the film has its own look where it looks like a 3D model mimicking exactly what a 2D image would do in traditional animation. This is also to further emphasize the fact that this is supposed to look like a comic book lifted to a screen. If the thought bubbles and everything else in this movie weren't indicators enough, there's a lot of things that this movie does to make it feel like a living comic book, and I would say it does so very adequately and very well. If you guys want to read about how this was achieved, again, I will be linking an article in the description.
There were times where I honestly thought I was watching the 3D version and the theater had forgotten to give me the glasses as I walked in. The film attempts to throw as much product placement and visual information on the screen as possible, either in an effort to appeal to modern audiences who need more reinforcement not to look down at their phones, or to prevent them from processing any of the action so as not to question the film's overall quality.
It is a Sony film with Sony product placement. That is pretty normal. These aren't there and meant to make you distracted. Product placement is typically there to do two things. One, to sell you on particular merchandise that you'll see in the movie and probably buy later, as is the purpose of all marketing. And two, to give these worlds a bit of familiarity. I don't personally have a problem with product placement usually, as long as it's done tastefully. And I'll be honest, every single time I've watched this movie, the product placement has never actually been distracting. It's always been a background element, as it should be. Unlike something like Man of Steel, where the product placement is very in your face.
It's as if some marketing man had said, don't give them time to think, or else they'll figure out it's actually bad.
I doubt that's actually what happened in the marketing department. Moreover, you seem to be in the great minority opinion where this movie is concerned. Do you feel like you're just that enlightened of an individual? You've discovered the truth of Into the Spider-Verse? Or is it more likely that your criticisms and your opinion are incredibly vapid? Given how you've spouted many opinions about the film, but you've not actually gone into detail about any of them, I'm beginning to believe that it's the latter.
Besides, these kids have ADHD anyway.
Ableism. I remember when I used to be so stupid I thought that was a good punchline.
The animation itself is terrible. With its low frame rate and jerky motion, it resembles less of a major motion picture costing $90 million and more a PlayStation 1 era video game cutscene.
I've already gone over why the animation looks choppy. It looks choppy on purpose because it's animated in 2s and not in 1s, because it doesn't want to look like your standard bog Pixar animation. It wants to look like traditional hand-drawn animation. Also, if you think that this looks like a PlayStation 1 era cutscene, you know that most PlayStation 1 cutscenes were also animated on 1s, right? This is because PlayStation 1 models animating at 30 FPS literally had a keyframe at every point of animation. So not only does it not look like a PlayStation 1 game on a technical level because the animation style is completely and totally different, two, you probably haven't played a PlayStation game in any amount of time if you really believe that this game looks like those cutscenes. Speaking of animating on 1s and 2s, a fun little tidbit. I'm gonna go ahead and link in the description a video about how Resident Evil 2 was compressed onto the N64, and the reason I'm doing this is to exemplify a point. The cutscenes in the PlayStation 1 version of Resident Evil 2 were animated on 1s. Every key frame had a point of articulation. To compress the game to work on the Nintendo 64, all of those scenes had to be animated on 2s, where there was only a keyframe on every other frame. This meant that there was a smear frame in between every single other image. This allowed the videos to take up less space and therefore fit on the N64 cartridge. The reason I bring this up is to exemplify the point that the animation styles are incredibly different. Animating on 1s and animating on 2s are two incredibly different methods of going into making dynamic characters function. Now, all of that wasn't actually necessary. I just wanted to gush about some of the technical aspects of porting RE2 because it was tangentially related to the animation thing. Anyway, point being, no, the movie does not look like a PS1 game. Go play a fucking PS1 game.
At a time where the PS4 Spider-Man game most likely cost around somewhere half of what Into the Spider-Verse cost, one has to wonder where exactly did that money go?
You are aware that high poly one-to-one animation with mocap is not the only way to make something look good. As an example, there was a time when we were getting the transition from the GameCube and PS2 era into the Xbox 360, PS3, and Wii era, where everybody was thoroughly convinced that games just looked better on the Xbox 360 and PS3 because they had higher poly counts and could handle things like bloom lighting easier. And yet, arguing that point is to say that the only thing that matters in making an image look good is how many polygons you can stuff into it, which ignored the graphical fidelity of games like Twilight Princess, Metroid Prime 3, and even Mario Galaxy. And also No More Heroes. Making super smooth animation with tons of polygons crammed in and super realistic lighting is not the only way to make something look good. Moreover, stylized animation can sometimes cost just as much, if not more, than your bog standard good animation. And actually, in the article on the animation that I'm linking in the description below, the one I've already referenced earlier, that point couldn't be made any more clear by the fact that the process of creating this film required them to break the animation pipeline that ImageWorks originally had used. That pipeline created what looked like bog standard Pixar animation, and that's not what they were going for in the film. A lot of people had to literally unlearn how they animated animated things normally in order to create the look and style of the film they were going for. As a result, Into the Spider-Verse ended up having an incredibly unique look that I can actually go back to time and again, and most other people can as well. Again, you're in the minority, but that's not the point. The point here is that the time and money went into reconstructing an already existing animation pipeline. All this information is readily available to you. If you want to be the kind of snob that thinks that jamming polygons into a model is the only way to make it look better, then maybe you shouldn't have a channel criticizing art ever.
One or two visual effects and establishing shots are nice, however you never get the chance to appreciate them, because then it's right back to the headache-inducing visual bombardment. The soundtrack, which many are lauding as the best since Black Panther, is abysmal. More of the same auto-tuned garbage that permeates radio and YouTube that wears out its welcome about 10 minutes into the film.
Not really. The audio in the film is meant to reflect Miles Morales. It's literally many times the audio he's listening to in his headphones. If you think it wears out its welcome, then that's just a matter of personal taste, but not a good piece of objective analysis.
It's hard to believe that many are claiming that this is the best Spider-Man film ever made, let alone one of the best animated movies of the year or even one of the best movies of the year. In reality, it's a confusing mess which never clearly distinguishes itself in terms of what it's trying to accomplish other than serving as a Sony focus group. It's a movie that doesn't know what it wants to be. It's not strictly a family movie, a comedy, or even a superhero film. The worst part is it's not even trying to be a movie for people who actually like Spider-Man. At best, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse feels more like a straight-to-video feature that you have looked at on the Best Buy shelf and could have easily ignored.
Given the amount of time and money and marketing spent on the movie, no, I don't think it actually could be that. Moreover, I don't know how many times I have to say that the movie does in fact know what it wants to be. It is a personal journey story about Miles Morales. There is a similarly reflected personal journey story for the Peter Parker of the other dimension. These stories work in tandem with one another, and they are the focus of the movie, and the movie does a very good job at focusing on that. There are other characters, but other characters existing does not make the movie unfocused. You claim that the other characters are cardboard cutouts, but in reality, they are supporting characters, and they fill their role as supporting characters. I think you might not actually know what makes a decent movie.
The message of the film delivered by Mary Jane Watson is that we can all be Spider-Man is lost in the surrounding awfulness that envelops it. I can only think back to The Incredibles when Syndrome said, "With everyone super, then no one will be."
You do realize that, one, he's a villain. You're not supposed to actually take what he said to heart as the real message of the film. Right? In The Incredibles, he believed that the only way he should be able to exist is as one incredibly exceptional person among many other peons. He needed to be the best. This is the lie he believed, and because he believed that lie, he was defeated. Also, Mary Jane didn't say that everyone is super, she said that everyone can be Spider-Man, because the story of Spider-Man is that everyone has the potential to be great. It doesn't say that everyone already is great, default de facto, but again, you've already established throughout this entire analysis that you have absolutely no idea what makes Spider-Man media what it is.
The worst part about this is that everyone praising this film doesn't seem to grasp the bigger picture. By giving Sony your money to see this and Venom, you are giving Sony the impetus to yank Peter Parker out of the MCU and deposit him in their own series of Spider-Man connected films. The very same they had plans for just before The Amazing Spider-Man 2 shit the bed, which means the bullet dodged after that film tanked will be reloaded into Sony's gun, cocked and ready, waiting to be fired.
No. While you might be able to make that argument for Venom because Venom is actually trying to construct its own Venom-verse, Into the Spider-Verse is a completely separate thing, not connected to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. For them to yank out Peter Parker from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they would have to be able to create a universe where he can exist, or let his universe continue from where it is right then. That universe would not be the universe of Into the Spider-Verse. That heavily stylized Marvel Ultimate look that goes into this film is not the same thing that the MCU Spider-Man, or even the Raimi Spider-Man, or even the Amazing Spider-Man films have attempted. Hell, even Venom did not do this. By this logic, buying the Spider-Man game on the PlayStation 4 is giving Sony onus to rip out Spider-Man from the MCU, because it is a product and a medium where Spider-Man can survive without the extended Marvel Universe. That's not how things work. These things are categorically separate. Sony wanted to rip Spider-Man out of the MCU so that they could profit off of him more because of his standalone successes in the MCU. For your argument to actually work, you would have to accept that giving money to something like Spider-Man Homecoming incentivizes Sony to rip Spider-Man out of the MCU because his success in standalone films is what will incentivize them to create standalone films with him not in the MCU. This category error is astoundingly simple, and yet you're committing it hard.
Already, there are plans for a sequel to this drivel and for an all-female Spider-Team movie. God help us all.
So what's wrong with an all-female Spider-Team movie or even a sequel to this one? Again, I've already established that this film is decent on its own. You just seem to be too busy choking on your own thin-dicked cynicism. But I'd imagine that the criticism for an all-female Spider-Team movie is basically just the old anti-SJW criticism of the all-female Ghostbuster movie. A movie that failed not because of its all-female cast, but because it tried to rely on things that did not make Ghostbusters great to begin with. This not understanding what your film is the problem. And unfortunately for you, this movie that we're talking about, Into the Spider-Verse, it does understand what it is. It is Easter eggs for Spider-Man fans, while also being a good standalone film for people who are not Spider-Man fans, while also being a new introduction to Miles Morales, a previously less than likable comic book character into a more likable skin. It knows that it's a personal journey movie. It knows that it doesn't have to rely on the extra characters from the other Spider-Man universes, but it has them in his window dressing because it wants to. They add flavor. They are seasoning. You don't say, oh, my salt and pepper aren't good on their own, so they're horrible. No, you accept the fact that the salt and pepper made your chicken tendies better. You nonetheless are eating the chicken tendies, though. Miles Morales is the actual meat of the chicken tender. The crunch on the outside is the Peter Parker secondary character, and all the other characters are the seasonings on top of the chicken tenders. I guess the only reason this analogy doesn't work very well is because Miles isn't actually as bland as an unseasoned chicken tender, but hopefully the analogy is not lost all the same.
Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is by people who know shit about nothing, writing about something that they don't understand.
Holy shit, I just heard a shit ton of projection there. This is ignoring all the dog whistles I heard throughout it, where you got mad that a blonde-haired, blue-eyed person got killed, and said that a graffiti artist wouldn't know anything about science, because there's a correlation between graffiti art and black people in gangs. I'm not flat out calling you a racist, I'm just saying that the pro-Aryan and anti-black dog whistles weren't lost on me.
The best Spider-Man movie ever? Not even close. Not even f***ing close. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse gets 1.5 out of 6 Chewbaccas. That's it for now. See you next time.
But should there even be a next time? Should I even spend any time actually watching anything else on your channel? If you go into every review on your channel in the same way that you did this movie, then I'm gonna have to go ahead and assume that the only thing that I'm gonna get out of your channel is confirmation bias if I already happen to be some pro-Aryan moron. Confirmation bias if I happen to be an anti-SJW, and confirmation bias if I happen to lack critical thinking skills and not care about movies as an art form. If those are the things that I'm gonna get out of watching your channel, and that's it, then I think that this is probably going to be the last time our paths cross. Then again, given the nature of my channel, maybe it won't be. But now, at this exceedingly long video, I need to go ahead and conclude it. So, what did you guys think? Personally, I think I've laid most of my criticisms to bear on the review, but maybe you guys have different thoughts. Let me know in the comment section below, and let's get this discussion going. Please, please, please look at the links in the description, the one from the New York Times about the animation of the movie. Please check out Jay's reviews and Totally Not Mark's channels, as they have a lot of influence in my opinions on this particular medium. And please read the article on character arts and how to properly construct them. With all that said, if you've made it to this part of the video, you know the drill. These are the patrons. If you are a patron who just recently became a $20 and higher patron, then after a month or so, you should actually have a slide here. And if you don't, please let me know. Then I can go ahead and get that commissioned and fixed for you. If you're just a regular viewer, then thank you for the view. That means a ton to me. Every single view helps me a little bit in YouTube's cancerous algorithm. And if you are a patron, a double thank you, because your view is part of that metric, and your contribution is literally the thing that allows me to consume food. Oh, and pay power and mortgage. Like, those are important too. You guys are awesome, and I wish I was able to do more for you. As I have time and spoons, though, I definitely will. But with all that said, I think I've probably padded this end of the video out as much as I can. So as always, everyone, insert end of video tagline here.